Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. This is your host, Ari Whitten, and today I am joined by Nick Ortner, who is the CEO and founder of The Tapping Solution and a New York Times bestselling author. And this is a really interesting topic and kind of a funny story behind how this podcast happened. I was approached by some people I work with kind of wanting to make this introduction, and I immediately kind of brushed off this whole tapping and EFT stuff. And I was like, oh, there's no science on that. You know, I looked at that probably 7 or 10 years ago. And I remember seeing just, there wasn't much research there. The research that was there was really unimpressive. And Nick actually reached out to me in response and basically was like, here's the studies that have been published in the last 7 years or so. And I actually looked through them and I was like, wow, there's some impressive stuff here. And I actually changed my tune and I was like, this actually does have strong science to support it. With that said, as kind of the background, kind of an interesting, fun background to this, welcome, Nick, and thank you for educating me on this topic.
No, look, thank you for having me. And I'm glad that the science is coming in. As we were saying before the podcast, it's one thing for people to have experiences. And to me, that's the most important thing, right? That someone can try this at home and say it worked for me or it didn't, right? So it's like, that's what's great about it. But especially when we're talking about this getting out in a bigger way, and we're doing a lot of work now with VA hospitals and in schools and more of the institutions of society that need this information, the science and research makes a huge difference because they want to know, like, prove it to me that it works.
For sure. Yeah. And I'm the same way. I protect, all the listeners of this podcast, everybody that's in my audience. I want to make sure that I vet everything that I talk about and make sure that there's sound science behind this. I don't want to be promoting any sort of nonsense and have misled people or have people wasting money on stuff that isn't real. With that in mind, let's go real basic here.
Yeah.
What the heck is tapping? And emotional freedom technique. And do you prefer tapping over emotional freedom technique? Or different?
It's funny. It's like we go back and forth in what we call it, right? Because the reason we use the word tapping, the way I describe it is tapping is sort of the equivalent to the word meditation. That's the umbrella term. And then there's all different forms of it. So when you have meditation, you have Vipassana, this and that, and all these different meditations. So tapping is the umbrella for that practice. Emotional freedom techniques is the specific kind of tapping that I learned and that I use, even though I'm always changing things and sort of coming up with my own thing. So, maybe that's changing too. But yeah, so tapping, we call it tapping, and that's why it's a great descriptive term, because we are literally physically tapping on endpoints of meridians of our body. And what the latest research has shown specifically is that when we tap on these endpoints of meridians, we send a calming signal to the amygdala in the brain. And a lot of people know the amygdala as that fight or flight or freeze response center. So when you're stressed out, when somebody sends you an email, your boss sends you an email and you're not happy with what it says, or you have a challenge in a relationship, or you're anxious about, something that's upcoming, your amygdala is firing, right? You have that pattern. That's what that feeling of stress is. And we all know that feeling of stress. What the tapping does is it calms that amygdala, especially when we do it while acknowledging that feeling. Hey, I'm anxious right now. I'm angry. I'm scared. I'm overwhelmed. We send that calming signal to the amygdala, and the body, the brain, everything relaxes. So that's the basic process. It's like, bring up what's bothering you. You go through the tapping process and then find relief.
Okay. So it's not just this physical tapping aspect of it. There's the other aspect is bring up what's bothering you.
Yeah, and I certainly think, like, some people will do the tapping in the morning just to sort of waken themselves up, and it's a relaxing process. I think the tapping by itself would almost be equivalent to yoga by itself, right? It's like, okay, you're stretching, you're doing something, you're activating these meridians in your body. The real magic is when you come up and you say, hey, this is how I feel, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm acknowledging it, and I'm doing the practice and doing the tapping and letting it go. So, for example, if someone has a fear of public speaking, like, what's the fear of public speaking? It's something that is running in the brain that says that scenario is dangerous, right? If you put me on stage with 3,000 people, I'm on stage and I'm talking, I'm doing my thing. There's no butterflies in my stomach. There's no part of it is that I've done it a lot, so it gets easier and easier. But from the beginning, it wasn't a scary experience for me because no part of my brain had said speaking in front of other people is scary. For many other people, they'll have experiences like they're in 5th grade and they get up to read in front of the class. They stumble on a word, everybody laughs at them. And in that moment, that little 10-year-old or 12-year-old, whatever age brain says, this is dangerous. Right? The things in our lives, the stress, the fear there are a series of this is dangerous. So when the brain says, everyone laughed at me because I was in front of them, it then says, I'm never doing that again. Or if I have to, here comes 7th grade and I got to give another book report and my 5th grade brain said this is dangerous. 3 months before I have to give the book report, I'm already stressed and anxious.
Right.
And that's the crazy thing about these patterns that we have in our lives. They're not just that immediate stress. It's like, I know many people listening think about, they stress about things in the future. Right? So it's like, okay, that book report's coming up. I'm bad at this. They're going to laugh at me and I'm going to panic until, that happens, and I'm going to sweat through the whole thing. And this is the worst part of it. I'm probably going to do a pretty poor job of that book report because I'm going to have a dry mouth and I'm going to be stressed and anxious. I'm going to forget what I'm going to say. And guess what's going to happen? They're going to laugh at me again because I just did a poor job on the book report. I'm going to say something silly. So these experiences tend to build on themselves. If you have a fear of public speaking, you're going to keep building all these other experiences that keep on telling you this is not safe, to the point where some people will be like, no, I won't speak in front of 3 people, right? Or I have social anxiety because, again, that same thing happened. It's my belief that just about everything in our lives, every place where we look and we feel stuck, whether it be in relationships or getting healthy and losing weight or improving your finances, the things that we want in our life, if we're not there, it's because we have these experiences, because we have this brain that has been conditioned step by step to keep us stuck.
Yeah. Going from that to this tapping solution, or this method of dealing with those blocks. I mean, it might, for somebody unfamiliar with this might seem kind of a bizarre thing. I'm tapping with my fingertips, like on my face and on these different parts of the body. I'm supposed to be tapping on meridian points. What the hell are meridian points? I can't see meridians.
Yeah.
What are you having me do? And I'm, kind of saying these words as I'm doing this. Where did this whole thing actually come from? Who invented this, and how did they come up with this?
It's a great question. And look, I think it's weird every day, and I've been doing it every day for the last 10 years. And every time it works, I'm astounded again and again. Like just yesterday, my wife was stressed and overwhelmed. We have a 2.5-year-old, she didn't sleep well. We didn't sleep well. It can get busy. It can get crazy. And, I've learned I'm a good husband. I don't say to tap on everything, right? That's not going to be a winning equation to try to fix my wife at every moment.
I'm just picturing her getting angry at something and you being like about to say it, and she's like,
yeah,
don't tell me to tap.
Exactly. No, I've learned my lessons, and I've learned, with friends and family, look, people will find their way. But she was overwhelmed, and I was out in the office and we were texting, and I said, hey, just take 5 minutes and tap or meditate, just very casually find a little space. And she told me later that she's like, I'm sitting there and I'm just so overwhelmed, and I'm angry that June didn't sleep and all these things. And I'm like, this tapping's not going to help this, right? Because when you're in that state, you're in that emotional state. She did it anyway. And 5 minutes later, she was astounded. She's like, all the negative thinking stopped. I felt so much better. I got my energy back. Like, it was a huge positive result. And when I heard about it, I was like, that's amazing. It worked, right? So I'm still surprised. But to answer your original question, right around 1980, Dr. Roger Callahan, who was a traditional psychologist, was working with a client by the name of Mary. And Mary had a water phobia. We were talking about public speaking before. That's a phobia if it's intense. So she had a fear of water, so intense where showers were scary, drinking water was scary. I mean, this is like a full-blown clinical fear. And Dr. Callahan had been doing what he knew to do as a psychologist: exposure therapy. Hey, let's look at the water and let's talk. Let's look about our past. But it was a lot of talking, right? It was like, that's traditional psychology is, and there's some great parts about it. I think tapping takes it to the next level, which is why a lot of psychologists are using tapping now. But it's very verbal, right? It's like, okay, let's think through our problems. Let's talk about mom for the next 10 years. See what we can do about it. He'd been working with her for about 1.5 years, and he was frustrated. As a psychologist, it's like, oh my gosh, here she is, and she still has this water phobia no matter what we do. They were at his home office by his pool, looking at the pool. Right? So it's like exposure therapy. There's water. Tell me what you feel. Do some deep breathing. What's going on? And she said, when I look at it, I have all these butterflies in my stomach. And he had been reading about the Chinese meridian system, and that the stomach meridian was underneath the eye. So this major endpoint of this stomach meridian underneath the eye. So just on a whim, on inspiration, whatever it is, he said, hey, try tapping underneath the eye while you look at the water. So she did. She tapped for about a minute, and the phobia cleared like that. I mean, an instant, she goes, I'm no longer scared. And from that day on, it was gone. It was just still, again, amazing. He proceeded to work on this system. What are the other endpoints of meridians? And he developed a system called TFT, which for different emotions and different challenges, you would do different things. So you might do, this for anger, and then this one for anxiety. And one of his students, Gary Craig, who developed EFT, said, you know what, this is hard to remember what points for what, and it's complicated. Let's just hit all the main points every time. Let's keep it as simple as possible, even though potentially one particular challenge might be unlocked, in essence, by the under the eye. Let's hit all the points. And that was EFT. So that's what he developed, and that's what I learned, 15 years ago now. Started using with friends and family, then made a film about it, and off we went.
Very interesting story. So why does this actually work? What's going on physiologically that translates into this alleviating psychological discomfort and traumas and things like that?
Yeah, great question. So there's two components that we can see right now. One is that amygdala that I talked about before, that this tapping, through pathways that we don't understand right now. I think we're learning more about. The Bong-M channels were discovered by this researcher, Kim Bong-M, that are these microscopic channels within the body that run along the meridian system. So in essence, showing, hey, there's these channels of communication that we don't know are there. So there's the amygdala, and then there's the meridian system. I mentioned the stomach meridian underneath the eye. And again, the way I look at it from the research that I see, we are just getting started in understanding them. And that's okay, I think, right? We tend to think, and every generation, every time and place does this, that we know everything, right? Like the knowledge that we have now is the knowledge we're going to have. There's the joke I'm sure you've heard in the patent office in 1920 or something like that. The guy who ran it said, there's no way anything else will be discovered, right? The most ridiculous thing.
Well, it's not just a joke. I mean, I think it's
it was real. Yeah, it was a real thing.
Story. Yeah.
Yeah. But a joke and how ridiculous it is.
Right.
But even though we hear that, we still think, and especially when it comes to the body, I wrote a book a couple years ago about tapping for pain relief. And I opened in the book with a story about reading a New York Times article about how researchers or doctors or whatever had just discovered a new ligament in the knee that they didn't know was there.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it blew me away because I would go, wait, what? What do you mean there was a ligament that we didn't know? Like, haven't we been cutting knees open? Haven't we cut open 1 million knees and seen everything?
Yeah, for a few hundred years.
Right. So, I think we're going to find, oh, wow, there's these microscopic channels in our fingers that we didn't know were there because we didn't have the right data to measure them or to see them. What's great is that we're working on the mechanisms. We have case stories and user stories in the thousands or millions. So there's that side of it. And as you mentioned to start, the research is coming in. Like, okay, do we know exactly why anxiety is dropping by X percentage? No, but we're seeing that it's dropping massively. Do we know why the cortisol, tapping has shown an hour session compared to placebo and cognitive behavioral therapy dramatically lowers cortisol in the body. Boom, shown in saliva, like, there it is, here's the cortisol, and now you did this, and it dropped. And as compared to CBT, which is talking, right? So the difference between you and I talking about our problems for an hour and you and I tapping and talking about our problems for an hour, dramatic drop in cortisol. So we're seeing the effects, we're seeing the user stories and the mechanism. I'm excited to see what we find out in the coming decades.
Yeah, I'm on the subject of how this research is conducted. I'm curious about a couple things that you just alluded to. One is the placebo and how they control for that, and then the other one is any instances where tapping therapies have been tested against traditional psychotherapy or CBT or something like that. And for those that don't know, CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. But this placebo effect thing is also interesting. Like, I'm curious, has any of the research said, okay, well, let's have you kind of recite the mantra or do the speaking aspect of this while tapping on completely different parts of the body that are not associated with any of these meridians? And have those studies been done, and what have they found?
Yeah, I don't know, to the last part of the question. I know that there are some mechanism papers that have been working on that. Like, okay, what if we do this, or what if we do that? I can't answer the placebo versus CBT versus tapping. I mean, that was a clear-cut study, and as I mentioned, with cortisol. So it's like, it's not just subjective, oh, I feel better, or some people say, well, the tapping is a distraction mechanism. So, oh, okay, well, it distracted me, so that's why I'm happy. You can't fake cortisol in the body. It's like either cortisol goes down or it doesn't. And tapping showed, there's a great story behind this study. The lead researcher, Dawson Church, did the study, sent out all the samples to the lab to get them all tested, and he was going to present a paper about it at a big conference. And he was waiting for the results, and he kept calling them. They said, we're working on it, this, that, and the other. And finally he said, what is taking so long? It's double the normal time, or whatever it is. And they said that they kept retesting the cortisol levels on the tapping group because they'd never seen a drop that dramatic in cortisol in an hour's time. So they thought, their initial instinct was, well, we're doing something wrong with the samples, or something happened, because they hadn't seen it in the testing they do for whatever other things that they do. They hadn't seen that dramatic of a drop in cortisol. So yeah, that one's there. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's the gold standard. That's what, and again, I'm not knocking it. It's a fantastic therapy, but there's a reason why I have psychologists and psychiatrists come up to me every day and say, oh my gosh, I brought this into my practice, to my existing practice, and I don't know how I functioned before. Like, I don't know what I've done the last 20 years because the results that people are getting are just out of this world. And I think there's a couple things in place there. Not only does the tapping work so well, but compared to CBT, you and I are working and talking together. We talk for an hour. Maybe you feel great after an hour, but I don't see you until next week or the month after. With tapping, the therapist can give the client something to take home.
Right.
So they can say, hey, on Saturday night, when you're lonely and anxious and depressed, here is a process you can do that's going to make your body feel better.
Right. And yeah, I mean, just for a little bit of context, also CBT has that to some extent. Sure. But what you're saying is this study actually showed that the tapping was more effective than CBT. Yeah,
and especially when it came to, again, in that particular one, cortisol. Yeah, and CBT. Look, if someone, if you have a good therapist, they should help people think differently outside of the office, right? That's the beauty of CBT. But to me, it's not like one or the other. I've got a friend who has developed, EFT CBT, right? So he's like, hey, look, let's just put the tapping on top of all these other great practices. We don't have to be, we don't have to, and if someone does, Jungian therapy, like whatever they do, they can just add this as a component. You're bringing the body in. And I think that's the real breakthrough in it, that, when that amygdala is firing, when we're in that stress state, when we're in that fight or flight response, this helps unlock that state.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually gone through a PhD program in clinical psychology, decided not to pursue a career in clinical psychology. But I mean, one of the things that's interesting that I can bring into this discussion is just to contrast the fact that so many of these different psychotherapeutic methods are very, very complex, very long and drawn out, require many years of schooling to be educated in these different paradigms and techniques.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about is a technique that can essentially be learned in 10 minutes. And there's research on it showing that it may be just as effective, or maybe in some cases more effective, as a lot of these very complex psychotherapeutic methods that may involve years of psychotherapy.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because there's a couple big components of that. One is, it'd be amazing if everyone on the planet could talk to a CBT therapist, once a week, but most people can't, right? 99%, 97% of the population, there's actually, economically cannot afford that. We don't have enough therapists for the people that need therapists. So there's that component of just supply and demand and making it accessible to people. Whereas, tapping in the at your fingertips, you can learn it online for free. Like, it doesn't require anything for someone at home who has no money or is desperate or is alone or is anxious to put the practice in place. So I think it's a great thing about it. That component in and of itself, again, not comparing or competing, but that's a leg up to go, hey, someone can do it on their own.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I mean, I appreciate your hesitancy to not compare and compete or want to, upset anybody. But at the same time, if the research is there showing this is as effective or more effective, I mean, that should be communicated, even if it pisses some people off who are educated in very complex methods of psychotherapy that involve, the patient coming to see them for years and so on. I mean, if you can accomplish the same end result in a matter of days or weeks instead of years and spending thousands of dollars, then that should be communicated to people, even if it pisses some people off. No,
for sure. And look, hopefully people aren't threatened by it, because great, if you went to school for 4 years to learn all these complex things, when you learn tapping and you sit down with that person in front of you and you do the tapping with them, you're going to bring insights to it that I won't bring, that someone who just learned it won't bring. So it doesn't mean that these tools can't complement each other. It's like, oh, okay, I gotta throw all this stuff out the window. Sure. It's sort of like saying to a medical doctor, oh, well, medical doctors, they're not going to learn nutrition because they learned all these other things, that they spend 4 years on. And nutrition, yeah, even though it makes it better and it's very important, like, we're not going to learn it just because it's important. So, but I am, the reason I don't want to compare and I don't want it to be a contest is I feel like when we look at the history of tapping, the passion with Dr. Callahan, who has sadly passed away, and with Gary Craig, it was very easy to set up these camps, right? So it was like tapping or no tapping. And it's like, I'm not saying either of them did it, but the community sort of had this idea like, well, you're an idiot if you don't do it, and it's like, no, let's be reasoned. Let's work on the research. I mean, for a long time, the research, first off, it's expensive, right? So it's like difficult to do, period. But the thinking was, well, it works so well and it's so obvious. And look, you can have someone come in who has a phobia and they're better 20 minutes later. So how can you argue it? That we didn't have that emphasis on, let's do the research right. And let's be thoughtful about this. And let's see where we're wrong and where we're right. So I try to bring a measure of that to the discussion, because I think that's how, if we want to the things that matter to me most, I work on spreading it to the general public, and especially in the self-help world and that kind of thing. That's where this is known. But what matters to me most is getting it in schools and getting in VA hospitals and these institutions. That's where the most people are, right? The most people are just, the veterans are showing up at the VA hospital. They're not buying self-help book as a majority of people. And that's where the world is. So what do we need to do with this technique to take the steps so it can be, and we actually were just accepted into the VA as an approved therapy just about a year ago, which is
awesome.
So yeah, what are those steps so we can be reasonable about it and we can help the most people?
Awesome. So one of the studies that you sent to me that I found most impressive was on PTSD. I would love if you could just give reader or listeners an overview of some of the most impressive research and what tapping has been found to be really effective for.
Yeah. And PTSD, we're talking about the Veterans Hospital the work being done there. So PTSD at its most basic level, total sensory overload, right? Too many experiences. We're talking about getting laughed at in front of the class, right? So that's a little experience that can keep you from speaking in public. Whole different story when you see, your buddy die in front of you, when you are at war for a year and your amygdala, that fight or flight response system, is on all day long, right? 7 days a week, 365, right? 24 hours a day. That amygdala is activated for good reason in that case, because you're in physical danger. You've got to stay on to keep yourself alive. So what often happens is for some people, and it depends on circumstances, then makeup and, how they go into war and just how their brains are structured, they come home and it's too much, right? Totally overwhelming. And what the tapping seems to be doing, step by step, as you look at some of those memories and send a calming signal, as you begin to rewire the brain, is it just calms everything down. I remember a great story from a couple years ago. We've donated DVDs and books to Fort Hood in Texas. We had a guy, sort of underground. This was before it was approved, tapping with veterans and giving them the books and all this stuff. And he tells a story about one veteran who walked into a Walmart, and the lights and the people and the noise, it was just like too much. It was starting to trigger him. So he started tapping. It's just like, I don't care that I'm in public, like I'm doing it right here, like to calm myself down. And two other guys walk by him and they look at him and go, keep tapping, it works.
That's awesome.
Like it's happening. And again, another example of being able to bring the tool in, like this guy's at Walmart and there's sensory overload and there's too much, and he can do something to calm his body in that moment, So yeah, we're getting there. We have more research lined up. We're even starting to look at stuff like DNA and RNA. More research is coming. As I said, we got approved to be in the VA, and hopefully that will open up a lot more doors to continue to help these guys in need.
Beautiful. I love that. So what else? Depression, anxiety, stress. I mean, based on the study you talked about earlier, lowering cortisol, I would imagine it's very effective just for lowering stress and anxiety in the midst of that happening.
That's it. Right in that moment, like, how do you lower anxiety? Doing the tapping. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then depression, depression's interesting because it's like, it's not easy, right? And it's heavy, it's complicated. I don't want to say it's more complicated than anxiety, but they're different beasts. Where the tapping can be effective with depression, besides releasing the stress around it and whatever the thinking patterns are, is that the physical component of tapping is an energizing process. As we said earlier, even if you just do the tapping without any focus on things, it's an energizing process. So depression tends to be a low energy process, and the tapping in and of itself can start to unlock, like, okay, I feel better and I'm taking deeper breaths and I can move forward. And oftentimes with anything we're doing, any intervention we're doing in our lives, we're just looking for a break, right? If we just start building a little bit of hope. The hope is a word I hear all the time with tapping with people. They go, I just feel some hope. Because here's the thing, when you're depressed and you're in the midst of it, there is no hope. And you've tried this and you've tried that and none of it has seemed to work. So now there's even less hope than there was before, because every failure sucks out some more hope. With tapping, it's so quick, it's so effective, it's so immediate. It helps unlock these energies in the body, and just then people say, I have hope. And whether it's the tapping that takes them totally out of the depression, or if they go, I have hope, so I'm going to exercise. Right? It's like, you got to just find these little places of energy. I have hope, it's going to exercise. And look, exercise is probably the best cure for depression out there. It beats all the placebos and it beats all the drugs, but there's no money in exercise. So I think it just begins to unlock it.
Absolutely. I know you've written a book on pain, and based on what you were just describing about this being, kind of depression being a low energy thing, I think there's obviously links to maybe dealing with chronic fatigue, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been tested yet in people specifically with chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, I haven't seen any studies that are like, chronic fatigue, and but we've done a lot with autoimmune conditions generally, with pain. The reason, my second book was on pain relief, because when I go up on stage and speak to people, usually what I do, I'll talk about tapping, and then I'll say, hey, let's have a demonstration. Who here is in physical pain? About a third of the audience will raise their hand, 25 to 35% any given time, which is just incredible that many people are in physical pain. And I'll pick 3 people from the audience, never met them, no idea what's coming, and we talk and we tap on pain relief. And time and again, people get results. And, you know, within 20 minutes of tapping, they go, oh my gosh, I haven't felt this good in, you know, ages. I was on a podcast a couple months ago and talking to the host. We're in person out in LA, and goes, oh, you know, works for pain. You know, let's get my buddy in here and let's tap on his neck. And this is a big podcast. So I'm like, you know, I want this to work. And guy sits down in front of me. And I was also a little nervous because guys tend to be emotionally closed up, and like this guy was just like his friend working in the other room, you know, so it wasn't like he was into this stuff per se. And talk about the placebo effect, right? Like whether it plays in. He came in having no idea who I was, you know, this, that, and the other, and he had a stiff neck. And you know, I was like, all right, so how much does it hurt? Oh, it's a 7 or 8. Okay, what's your range of motion? And he'd be like this, and then like this. So like really limited range of motion. So we do the tapping, and I'm asking him about what's going on in his life and stress. And honestly, it wasn't, if you listen to the tapping, it wasn't great tapping in that sometimes I'll work with someone and you really like dive in, right? And be like, oh my gosh, I realized that this was happening, and we unlocked a vulnerability and had a big breakthrough, and now the pain's gone, right? This wasn't that. So I'm a little nervous. I'm like, boy, this guy's closed up. He's clammed up, and I need some more time than the 10 minutes I have with him on a podcast. Maybe if I had an hour to get a little rapport and go deeper. Okay, we're doing the tapping, do this, that, and the other. All right, let's see your neck. And he goes, whomp, whomp.
Wow.
Back and forth. Pains, oh, it's like a 1 or a 2. I can't believe it. And then just the range of motion, like huge, you know. So what happened in that moment?
You know, real quick for people listening to this, not watching the video, basically what Nick just showed is the difference between when the guy was initially in pain, he could barely move his neck, he could barely twist from side to side, and then after the tapping, his range of motion dramatically improved, which is generally range of motion correlates very well to the degree of pain and restriction in the area.
Yeah. So, you know, that shows that even, you know, I'm sure he was, and this is another cool part about the process, that maybe he, you know, he's on a podcast, so he's not telling me everything that's going on in his life. And maybe he was just really he just had a baby and he didn't feel good enough as a father, right? I'm making things up. And he's thinking this and that's stressing him out, or he's not keeping up, or he's angry about something. We did the tapping. He didn't have to tell me these things. But if he was accessing the emotions because I was telling him about the stress and this, that, and the other, he was doing his own work. And that's a place where for therapists, you know, a therapist doesn't have to say, you know, we sit down for the first time and there isn't that rapport, or someone feels shame or guilt about something and they go, you know, I don't want to say this to my therapist, right? Like I'm embarrassed with what I did. I'm embarrassed what I said. I feel too vulnerable to share. They don't have to share. They can just think it in their mind, go through the tapping process and begin to unlock it. And then what usually happens is, okay, now I release the shame about what happened or the guilt because of X, and now I can talk about it. You know, and then that opens it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other things you talk about in your work is peace or panic. Can you describe what that's all about?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, we talked about that amygdala firing, and it's either firing or it's not. Now, there's levels of it. It could be like full-blown danger, and then I'm a little stressed. I think if we look at our days, if we look at our lives, they are, you know, again, within a scale, a mix of peace or panic. And at the end of the day, the outward events can be controlled. You know, our inner experience we can be in control of our inner experience. So a stressful morning because the kids are running around and, you know, got to get lunch ready and this, that, and the other. Even that experience, that busyness, that busy day can be conducted from a place of peace or panic. Right now, I can be conducting this podcast and answering your questions from a place of peace or panic. There's sides, right? So there's the ultimate peace where I'm like meditating and zened out. And then there's a little bit of panic and a little bit of stress, or extra panic and stress. I think that distinction, and the reason why I talk about it in my book and I talk about it with tapping, is that we can aspire in everything we're doing to move away from that panic and towards that peace. And tapping is a tool to help us get to that place. And it's what I hear time and again from people where they go, you know, I read your book the last month and I've been doing the tapping and my whole life's the same, but I'm happy, you know, or like, you know, I still don't love my job, but I'm not stressed out every day. And now I have the resources to maybe change my job or make better decisions.
Yeah.
So that is the starting point for everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that distinction. It's actually something that's personally meaningful to me because I have a son. He's a little over 1 right now. And so my wife and I have just gone through this initial first year of his life, which you have kids, right?
I have a 2.5-year-old. Yeah.
So yeah, so you know how that is and how
Yeah.
stressful and hectic your life becomes and how there's this constant demand on you. And it at certain times it can feel overwhelming to just have an unceasing, unrelenting demand on you.
Yeah.
Even, for her, especially, through all hours of the night, even. And it gets to the point where you just feel overwhelmed by this constant needing to care for the demands of this other creature, this other being. And um, I think it kind of naturally just wires you into this mode of panic all the time, of you're doing all the things you need to do, but you're in this constant state of stress, panic, anxiety, feeling like just worried, and like you just end up in this place of you're still doing everything you need to do, but you're panicked and stressed the whole time.
Yeah.
And one of the discussions my wife and I had just a couple months ago is like just this realization, like, hey, it's possible to still do everything we need to do and care for him and get everything we need to do done, but do it with a smile on your face and while being relaxed and not being stressed and overwhelmed and irritable and annoyed the whole time, but actually like do it all and be in a good place.
Well, that's huge. I mean, right? That's huge. But it doesn't come naturally to people. And we have to think about it and we have to be conscious about it. And you're going to get knocked off and you're going to find yourself in that moment like, oh, here I am again, and that's okay. So how do I find peace? So I'll make sure to send you my next book, which comes out in about a month and a half. It's sort of like a side project, is Tapping for Parents and Kids.
Tapping for baby overwhelm disorder.
It is. I mean, the first, so the first 8 chapters are, it's tapping for parents and kids. And we talk about how to do it for ADD and autism and all these other conditions for kids. But the first 8 chapters are, how do you tap as a parent, right? How do you, what's that thinking? That thinking is the baseline of everything. And especially, well, even later in the book, when we talk about your child's ADD and how you might use tapping to help them focus and calm down, the first step is always for you as a parent to do your own tapping on that issue, because we bring so much baggage. We're like, oh, my child has an anger problem and they are broken and they need to be fixed and yada, yada. So doing that internal tapping on the stress and the anxiety and the belief, everything that tends to change the relationship even before you get to the kid.
For sure. Yeah. And I can attest to the fact that kids are very sensitive beings and they really pick up on a lot of these energies that are there, that you're emanating, that you're not even necessarily conscious of.
So, absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the other things you talk about is kind of this negativity to positivity ratio. And specifically, you talk about a 3-to-1 ratio being important to thrive in life. So what's that all about?
Yeah. So, that deals with the negativity bias, which is that fight or flight response that's happening. And the negativity bias in particular talks about this idea that we are conditioned through many eons of evolution to look for the negative. Right? We are looking for the tiger in the bushes, because the guy who looked for the tigers in the bushes found the tiger or noticed it and ran away. The happy-go-lucky affirmation spouting, the guy who was tapping then because he was all relaxed or whatever, he got eaten, right? So we're conditioned to look for the negative, which is why, as we know, we can have someone, we can, get 100 positive emails. We run this podcast, we get 100 emails, people say they love it and everything, and then one person says something really mean about it.
Yeah.
And the other 100 are out the window, right? They just they're gone. It's like our brain locks into that negative to stay safe, to fix it, to make sure it doesn't happen again, etc.
For sure. And it's so true. I mean, even in my own personal experience, even being conscious of this, I still find myself, I'll get 500 or 1,000 positive comments and I'm like, yeah, whatever. Great. Yeah, I know it's good. And then one person is pissed off, which there's always someone who's
Guaranteed.
mad about something. I mean, anytime you know that when you're putting work into the online space,
100.
there's always one person or two people
If
out
there
there.
isn't, you're not doing a good enough job because you're not reaching enough people. Right. So,
Yeah. So there's always that one. And it's crazy that even I find myself still always being concerned with that one person, which is the last person I should be concerned with.
no, absolutely. Absolutely.
And yet, we have such a strong negativity bias. It's crazy.
But so here's when I read about the negativity bias in the first place, my friend Rick Hansen wrote about it in a couple of his books, and it just like opened up this world. It seems so obvious. Just knowing about it is a huge step forward, because when you know about it and you read that comment and you just go, all right, there's my negativity bias. Like, it's doing its thing, like I can watch it and I can know that my brain's doing its thing now. I can tap on it to release it, and that works really well, even though I just can't stop thinking about this comment, and boom, the body lets go. And then when it comes to the positive, that's when that's an active practice to go, okay, there's going to be 1,000 comments that are all positive, and I'm going to read one that just really moves me, and I'm going to read it 10 times, and I'm not just going to read it. I'm just going to sit with it and pause and go, whoa, like that was a real person who watched what I did and then sat down in front of their computer and typed these words, put themselves out in the public to say, you really helped me, or you changed my life, or I'm so grateful. Like, that is huge. Just one of those comments is absolutely huge. And now you're just building that muscle in the brain. It's that positivity muscle. But I think these practices are important, because if not, the winds and the whims of life just blow us around, and we could be uber successful with all these things happening, and we remember the 3 people who criticized us in the last 10 years.
Right. Yeah, it's so true. And it definitely needs to be a conscious practice to savor all of those positive comments instead of overlooking them as you're browsing for the one person who's writing something.
You're just looking for the tiger in the bushes. I mean, just noticing that when you're scrolling through the comments, looking for that, your brain is going, where's that tiger? Let me find it. Let me find that tiger, as opposed to looking at the sunset and the trees and the stars.
Yeah, for sure. And I've had to make it a conscious practice for me. I think maybe we all have a super strong negativity bias. I feel like I probably had a particularly strong one. I don't know, because I don't know other people's experience, but mine is very strong. And I've had to really make it a conscious practice, but it's paid dividends. It's a beautiful practice to, when I get those positive messages, instead of overlooking them and looking for the negative ones, to really sit and savor the fact that I've improved someone's life. And it really does, when you make that a practice, it really does translate into you feeling so much better in your own life.
Yeah, no doubt.
So one other thing I want to talk about, particularly relevant to my audience of people dealing with fatigue, is the concept of an energy leak.
Yeah.
What is that all about, and how can people repair their energy leaks?
Yeah, that's great. So if you think, and let's just imagine that every day when you wake up in the morning, you download 100 units of energy or $100 of energy. Like that's your energetic starting point. Let's make believe we all get it, boom. And what tends to happen in our life is that, talking about that girl in 5th grade where she got up in front of the class and people laughed at her. In that moment, her energy went to that experience, right? It was just like, hey, that's costing you $1 because you're walking around every day with that imprint of that thing. And then there's current day stuff. So if you're stressed out about, something you have coming up 3 weeks from now, or an email you got today, you take $5 of your energy and off it goes. If you have an unhealed relationship, when you think about your mom, whether she's with us or not, or your dad, whether they're with you or passed away, you think about them and you go, there's stress and anxiety and fear and anger and all this emotion. Now you take $20. It's like, hey, that's a big relationship that is unhealed, that is stressing you out, and you put it there. We tend to think, because we don't think about these things on a daily basis, but we tend to think, oh, yeah, I hate my mom, but I just don't think about her, and I don't think about the relationship, and I just block it all out so it doesn't affect me.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is happening beneath the surface of conscious awareness.
100%. And if there's a relationship or an event or an experience or whatever that when you think about, you get a goo in your body, it's costing you energy. And I think it's literal, and I think it's physical energy. Like, I think that you are going to have less energy to move around to do the things that you want in your life if you have unhealed relationships, if you have things in the past that you can't let go of. The contrast is, if you think about, we all had high school breakups, right? Most people had, and whether at high school or college, and especially like our first bad breakup, when it was like, oh, I dumped her, she dumped me, we were heartbroken, whatever it was. I can talk about a breakup in college. I remember it so clearly. She broke up with me, and then we got back together. I broke up with her, and I remember the first heartbreaker when she broke up with me. I can remember lying in my bed in my college dorm room, just like, thinking the world was going to end. And I remember that, and I can talk about this, and there's nothing here, right? It was like, that is a healed, gone experience. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that might happen for me or someone else is they can remember something like that, and they go, and I'm still heartbroken, or I still don't trust, or I'm still scared, or I'm still holding on to it. So if you are holding on to something from the past, it's costing you energy. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Yeah. And one of the other, I think, biggest energy leaks that I see a lot of people that I work with and people with fatigue dealing with is lack of self-acceptance.
Oh, absolutely.
And I mean, it's such a, there seems to be such an epidemic now of people who grow into adulthood and go through their whole lives even without ever really coming to a place of fully accepting, fully loving, fully appreciating who they actually are. There's just these deep elements of, I don't like this part of myself.
Yeah, 100%. The basic EFT tapping statement is, even though, when you fill in the blank where I'm angry or I'm upset or whatever, even though blank, I love and accept myself, or I love, accept, and forgive myself. And it's really, a cornerstone of that deeper work, because that's the key to everything. Now, I talk about in my book specifically, people struggle with the idea of loving themselves and accepting themselves, in part, I think, because they often think that they have to do it 100% immediately, right? So it's like, oh, if I have to accept myself, that means I have to accept all of me and everything I've done and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, since they can't do it perfectly and they can't do it 100%, and they don't even know what it would feel like to do it, I'm not even going to try to do it. That's why I start playing with, with language and thinking around like, hey, can you accept a little part of yourself, right? Is there like, can you accept your pinky toe, right? Like, there's a little element where you go to have a starting point. Because most people, when you talk about loving yourself, people just don't, what does that mean? What does that feel like? Well, on a scale of 0 to 10, if 10 was absolute love for yourself, could you love yourself at a 2? What would that feel like? Well, I'd stop and appreciate this and notice that. And then from that foundation, we can build. We can build to have that grow. And like everything else we've talked about today, which, people don't like to hear because they want to be fixed tomorrow, right? But it's a process. I'm in the process of loving myself more every single day and accepting myself more every day and accepting who I am and what I do and the choices I make. And then you get thrown a little off track and you go, okay, I'm going to get back. But no, you were absolutely right. That underlying love and self-acceptance, the drain that has on your health when you don't have it, is massive.
Yeah. It's interesting, looking back on my own life. One of the things I struggled with a lot was during my years in school, in high school, in university and graduate school. My brain, for whatever reason, I could not get my brain to work in subjects that I didn't have an interest in. I mean, and I think everyone has this to one degree or another. I think that I had it to a very extreme degree where my brain just like would not do work for subjects that I was not interested in. So I wouldn't do particularly well in those classes. And, for a long time, especially when all of my coursework in the younger years, when all of my classes were things that I wasn't interested in, I wasn't a very good student. And not that I was I was just an average student through most of my younger years. And, thought I was kind of average, brain power and average, skills and knowledge and so on. And it wasn't until I started to get into the subjects that I was interested in, that I was passionate about, that I realized that I have a really unique gift and for that, and kind of a what Dan Sullivan might call it, like a genius zone in certain areas. And for me, it's very polarized that like my lack of ability in things that I'm not interested in is all, I think, directly related to the fact that I have special abilities in things that I am passionate about. And it took so long to realize that and appreciate that about myself and get over the fact that I wasn't particularly good at certain subjects. And realize, wow, that's because my brain is wired to be like obsessive and really good at certain things, but not so great at other things.
No, I love that. And these are the distinctions where you just reframed everything about yourself, right? It was like you took the rules of right and wrong that you had learned from wherever society, and you said, no, this is the way this is the truth of who I am, what I'm good at, recognizing what I'm not good at and being okay with what I'm not good at. And I'm with you. I'm like, if I think about my business life the last 20 years, and especially the last 10 years in the tapping world, half the time I spend on the phone with somebody about something, right? And for a long time, I would say to myself, after a long day of being on the phone with 8 different people, I would feel like that was easy to me. So then I wasn't productive because I had these rules that productivity must mean sitting at my laptop suffering, whether doing 1,000 emails or writing a book or blah, 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 whatever it was. And just chatting on the phone with friends and business partners and affiliates and that was somehow not work. Maybe because it was too easy, right? We had that Puritan value that it has to be painful. And step by step, I started recognizing like, no, this is a strength of mine, right? Whatever I did during that day, communication, brainstorming, creativity, ideas, delegating, like that is a strength. So I'm going to own that strength, stop beating myself up for, whatever the other things that I thought I should be doing were. And especially in this day and age where we have so much opportunity and so much coming at us, it's more important than ever to recognize what is it that you want in your life, like, right? Why are you doing this? Like, why are you getting up in the morning? What is that mission? Not trying to do it perfectly, being aware. Social media is great in some ways when it comes to community and great resources and information. And then, the dark side of it is the comparison to others and the idea that someone else is doing something more exciting at any moment than you are, and they're posting the perfect picture on Instagram or Facebook, and you're somehow failing to live up to that. So deciding for yourself, what do you want out of your life? What do you want to experience? And it's something that I work on every day. Like, what do I want? What are the choices? What brings me joy? And how do I make that happen?
Yeah. And I think getting to that place of self-acceptance, accepting things that are not your ideal about yourself, or areas where you're not that strong, and really owning the areas where you do have strengths, and stepping into that full acceptance of kind of the totality of who you are, strengths and weaknesses, I think is critical to becoming a mature person, and also a healthy, well-adapted person that is happy, that likes their life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. Agree with you completely.
Yeah. So I know you wrote a book recently. What personal kind of experience, what growth did you experience personally while writing that book?
Yeah, great question. So my latest book is The Tapping Solution for Manifesting Your Greatest Self. We've been talking about some of the concepts that are through it in there. I think this was my most personal book to date, and that I shared different stories about my life. I'd done that in some other books, but this was me talking about June waking up at 3 a.m. and what that looks like. and what this process looks like. What I loved about writing this book is that I really owned, if I look at who I am in the world and why I think I'm here and what I'm doing, it's to be an ambassador to tapping, besides being, a great dad, trying to be a great dad and all these other family things. When it comes to the business side, I'm an ambassador for tapping. I didn't invent this, but I communicate my thoughts and feelings about it. And with this book, I really owned the different ways of thinking that I have about it, even when it comes to books themselves. Like I work with my publisher on this book to change the line spacing from what other books do all the time. I kept looking at them going, these are impossible to read, and our brains are changing, and we're looking at social media and short stuff, and we're seeing more white space. And I'm saying these books are hard to read. Can we make it easier to read for people? And the publisher was like, wait, no, but that's not how we do the spacing. And we tried it, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is so much easier to read. So I really enjoyed that part of the journey of going, how can I, truly change someone's life with this book? I had test readers as I was writing the book, which was a different experience for me as well. And that was really positive because it was different than, an Amazon review is so great. You get, oh, I read the book, I loved it, etc. This was, on day 4, I really had such an insight with this, or I had such a question about that. So it was a much more intimate experience for me with those test readers. That wasn't like the book is written, I speak it and it's done, and I write it and it's out in the world. It was a collaboration. It was collaboration with real people where I saw what was resonating with them. And I wrote day 12 and saw that, I was wrong. This wasn't an issue for people, or I wasn't explaining myself clearly enough. So I really enjoyed that part of it. And I think, going forward, that collaboration, getting that feedback loop, we're working on an app right now, which should be out in a couple months. And I'm excited about the feedback loop there, that I will have data and talk about research and studies that, someone can do a 5-minute anxiety meditation and they're going to have their number before and after. And we're going to get that data back if they're willing to share it, to show these are the changes that are happening. Or we're going to see, hey, someone did this process, you're flying, and it wasn't working for some reason. Like, we're not seeing the change. So we have to do something different in the process or the language or the length. So that's been my exciting, in writing this book. Like, how do we make this a dynamic process? So it's not all the ideas in my brain are all right, and I'm going to tell you how to do this process. Like, no, like we're discovering this. Let's work together to unlock these challenges and issues. That way we can reach the most people in the most effective way.
Beautiful. I love this process. I love the fact that I initially brushed this off, and that
Absolutely.
you by sharing the research that educated me and actually showed me, like, hey, there's really good science that shows this works, and that the research itself is very impressive. So with that said, where can people learn more about this? And I know that you have a gift that you're going to give all my listeners. We're going to put a link on the page for this, which is going to be at theenergyblueprint.com/tapping. And so what is that gift, and how can people learn more about how to actually implement this in their lives?
Yeah, great. So, that's the first 2 chapters of my New York Times bestselling book for free. So you can get started. Within those 2 chapters, you learn all about the science, the research, and how to do the tapping, right? So you can go and run with that. We also have a stress relief CD, which is a digital format, kind of takes you through a guided process. So if you're more auditory and want to just be taken through that comes with it. And then from there, we'll share emails and resources with you to go further. I mean, the sky's the limit on what you can do here, but just get started with the basics, have an experience. Read the first 2 chapters, do the tapping, have an experience. That way you can decide for yourself, this made me feel better, because at the end of the day, that's what we want, right? What are things that make me feel better that I can use in my life today?
Beautiful. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Nick. It's really been such a pleasure having you on and having this conversation. And I know it's going to help a lot of people. So
I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care.